Now that we've established where Dune came from and at least some of what it's meant to do and represent, our final bit of pre-plot edging involves taking a quick look at what Dune is not and what it quite deliberately does not represent. Since Dune is in large part a repudiating thing, and since repudiation is itself a positive act, what this story isn't supposed to be is key to grasping what the story is supposed to be, which means it's time to talk hero's journey. Plenty of people are at least familiar with the term, as you'll often hear it referenced with regard to Dune's popular, if inapt, comparators, particularly Star Wars. This is by design, since George Lucas is on record extolling the virtues of one Joseph Campbell, with whom the term hero's journey is most commonly associated. Campbell laid out the 17 stages of his hero's journey in his 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and his 3-act list of archetypal stages has been condensed, refined, and reworked by a number of later writers and directors ranging from George Lucas to Stanley Kubrick to Rick and Morty's Dan Harmon, who applies his Campbell derivative story circle to pretty much every writing project he's attached to. Since Star Wars is so often used as a Dune comparator, and Luke's journey is so obviously a hero's journey, and since Lucas has spoken extensively of Campbell's influence on his own works, Luke Skywalker's OT story is the easiest tool with which to illustrate the various stages, before we move on to the reasons Dune is not and was never intended to be a hero's journey. The first step in the Campbell circle is, of course, the call to adventure, initiated in A New Hope by Leia's message as transmitted via R2. Though the message is intended for Obi-Wan, the old man knows he'll need help, and is already aware of Luke's potential. These, after all, were the good old days where family lineage was a vital determinant of one's Jedi potential, before the dark times, before Disney.
Put another gay diverse woman in it, make it more fucking lame!
So Kenobi asks Luke to come with him to Alderaan, which leads to step 2 of the Campbell progression, refusing the call. Luke, at this point miserable and beaten down, having grown up with his uncle's limited horizon, refuses Kenobi's request, offering only to take him as far as Anchorhead. It's only upon returning home to find Aunt Beru and Uncle Owen have been cooked by the Imperials that the millstone keeping him on Tatooine is cut away from his ankle, which, since ideally every stage in the hero's journey begins establishing several later stages, foreshadows his metamorphosis. But in the immediate, it progresses the story to step 3, supernatural aid, as embodied materially in the guiding wizardly figure of Obi-Wan, and immaterially in his first glimpses of the Force, the stand-in for Mother Nature in Campbell's Jungian scheme. Step 4 is the crossing of the first threshold, which you can locate in Star Wars either in the Mos Eisley Cantina, since it's about as alien to the farm boy as any truly alien world is, or, and more cleanly, in the Falcon's escape from Tatooine, which carries the hero definitively away from home and into the realm of adventure. Incidentally, if you're one of the many people who finds Disney Star Wars' constant returns to Tatooine dull and frustrating, that's because modern Star Wars completely misunderstands what Tatooine is and what it represents. It's the thing you have to leave in order to have an adventure, and its only other importance in a hero's journey is the symbolism of that hero returning to it, which Disney Star Wars entirely balked by switching in Rey for that final encapsulating moment. Tatooine in the hero's journey can only be important as the beginning and the end of a journey, and that importance is entirely personal and mythical. Tatooine is not important to anyone else at any other time in that journey, and returning to it for the sake of a member-berry high produces bland storytelling because it elevates the significance of the place, and so it destroys any sense of contrast with actual adventure. Moving on with hero's journey proper though, step 5 is known as the belly of the whale, which is where the hero signals openness to transformation and metamorphosis, the casting off of the old self and the taking on of the heroic identity. You can make an argument for the corresponding scene in A New Hope being Luke's first training session on the Falcon, since it's here that Luke first shows his willingness to become a Jedi, even as he suffers setbacks against the training remote. But the clearer match, and the one Campbell himself picked when asked to evaluate Star Wars against his outline, is the Death Star, specifically, in Campbell's mind, the trash compactor, since the Death Star is the setting where Luke definitively makes the jump from farm boy lost in space to hero of the rebellion in rescuing Leia and leaving with a cause and a mission. The great thing about OT Star Wars as an example of all this, by the way, is that each of the 3 films pretty much replicates the hero's journey internally, and the entire trilogy story replicates it as a whole. So though I'm sticking principally to A New Hope in this section, you can apply each of these steps to Empire and Return of the Jedi individually, as well as to the completed story of all 3. The Road of Trials, for example, which is step 6, could in A New Hope be the training remote sequence and the Death Star escape. Or with a trilogy-wide view, it could encompass everything from the destruction of the first Death Star to, via the Battle of Hoth, Luke meeting Yoda on Dagobah. Sticking strictly with A New Hope, this leads directly to steps 7 and 8, meeting with the goddess and the woman as temptress, both of which are, I think, combined in Leia in A New Hope, since Leia is simultaneously a prospective sexual interest, woman as temptress, and the embodiment of the world's love and goodness, being the morality and character of the rebellion personified. Step 9, then, is known as Atonement with the Father or Abyss, though, and since this is based on Jungian psychoanalysis, it's important to remember that the father needn't be the actual parent of the hero, but is rather the thing that holds ultimate power. Empire makes this much easier for us because Vader simultaneously is Luke's father and the holder of ultimate power over him. But a case can still be made that A New Hope places this in the object of the Death Star as the emblem and representative of the all-powerful galactic empire. Or if you buy the idea that at least some inkling of Vader's status as Luke's father was present in the writing of A New Hope, then Vader's presence on the Death Star accomplishes much the same thing. So, flying with Rogue Squadron to attack the Death Star symbolizes Step 9 in A New Hope, and Step 10 follows swiftly, Apotheosis, the stage where the hero reaches a moment of new understanding, which prepares him to confront the most difficult challenge of all. Luke's apotheosis is symbolized by his turning off the targeting computer and placing his trust in the Force, something Campbell himself particularly liked, and addressed explicitly in his interview series with Bill Moyers, The Power of Myth. You can find much of that on YouTube, but I'll quote here from the book version of that series because it's useful in setting up an essential differentness between Star Wars and Dune, between the hero's journey and the path Frank Herbert picks for Paul Atreides, which we'll explore in more depth a little later. For now, and I quote, Campbell reveled in the ancient themes and motifs of mythology unfolding on the wide screen in powerful contemporary images. On this particular visit, having again exulted over the perils and heroics of Luke Skywalker, Joe, that's Joe Campbell, grew animated as he talked about how Lucas has put the newest and most powerful spin to the classic story of the hero. And what is that? I asked. It's what Goethe said in Faust, but which Lucas has dressed in modern idiom, the message that technology is not going to save us. Our computers, our tools, our machines are not enough. We have to rely on our intuition, our true being. Isn't that in the front to reason? I said. And aren't we already beating a hasty retreat from reason as it is? That's not what the hero's journey is about, says Campbell. It's not to deny reason. To the contrary, by overcoming the dark passions, the hero symbolizes our ability to control the irrational savage within us. Campbell had lamented on other occasions our failure to admit within ourselves the carnivorous, lecherous fever that is endemic to human nature. Now he was describing the hero's journey not as a courageous act, but as a life lived in self-discovery. And Luke Skywalker was never more rational than when he found within himself the resources of character to meet his destiny. Ironically, the book continues, to Campbell, the end of the hero's journey is not the aggrandizement of the hero. It is, he said in one of his lectures, not to identify oneself with any one of the figures or powers experienced. The Indian yogi striving for release identifies himself with the light and never returns. But no one with a will to the service of others would permit himself such an escape. The ultimate aim of the quest must be neither release nor ecstasy for oneself, but the wisdom and the power to serve others. One of the very many distinctions between the celebrity and the hero, he said, is that one lives solely for the self, while the other acts to redeem society. End quote. Keep that in mind for later, because the similarities are consciously achieved in order to undermine the status of the hero in Dune. The Butlerian jihad, the refusal of technological messiahs, the job of the hero being to overcome destructive passions, all of which are themes present in Dune. But then, of course, we get to the final goal and the point of departure between them, the hero acting to redeem society. Luke is capable of achieving this, and Paul is not, but as I say, we'll return to this in due course. For now, let's just quickly round off the Campbellian stages of Star Wars. We come next to the ultimate boon, the fulfillment of the quest, which finds its representation in the escape from the Death Star with the princess and the plans, which were, after all, the win conditions entailed in Leia's call to adventure at the beginning. We then move into the third act, the return, which A New Hope speeds through at some considerable pace, while the whole trilogy obviously has more time to break out each of the various stages. But sticking just with a single film for the sake of conciseness, the closest A New Hope comes to refusal of return, which is the first step of the third act, is Luke lamenting Kenobi's death on the Falcon immediately following their escape from the Death Star. It's not an outright rejection of the mission, in that Luke isn't about to abandon the rebellion in this moment, but it is a moment of spiritual near defeat, in which the mission is momentarily out of his sight. Luke, having lost his guide, has lost his vision, and all he sees, for these few seconds at least, is grief. He's very quickly pulled out of that myopia by the coming of the next Campbellian step, the magic flight. This is where the heroes are pursued by whatever gods they've just stolen the ultimate boon from. In our case, that's the Empire pursuing them for the plans they've stolen and tracking them all the way to Yavin. Which brings us then to the 14th step. Rescue from without. I don't really need to explain this step to you, I'm just going to let Han Solo do the rescuing.
I have you now. What? Yeah! Look out! You're all clear, kid. Now let's blow this thing and go home.
Then we get to the 15th step, crossing the return threshold, which finds probably the shallowest interpretation of all these stages in A New Hope. Traditionally, this stage has the hero grapple with the come down after a fantastic adventure, a return to a kind of normalcy that might seem soul-crushing for the hero. The closest Lucas really gets to this step in A New Hope is Luke landing back on Yavin after the Death Star's destruction and being reminded by C-3PO's distress that he may well have lost R2 during the fighting, so the victory has come at a cost that must now be reckoned with. But this stage really only amounts to a few brief seconds since R2 can be repaired, and we're coming to the film's last scene. There's not really enough time to dwell in any kind of melancholy here. That last scene is the medal ceremony, and it combines the final two steps of the hero's journey, these being Master of the Two Worlds and Freedom to Live. Luke is, if we end the story after just this film, now a master of the material and the spiritual worlds, having been rewarded for his material exploits that he only achieved by finally giving in to the spiritual, allowing the Force to guide him. And freedom to live in the Campbellian mold really translates as freedom from the fear of death. And if crossing the return threshold was difficult to detect in A New Hope, freedom to live is the exact opposite. After all, they've just destroyed something called the Death Star. They've saved Yavin and the rebellion, and they've defeated the Empire. You don't get a much clearer defeat of the fear of death than the destruction of the Death Star. And that's it. That is all 17 steps of the hero's journey, pretty much every single one of which is represented in A New Hope. And then again over the two sequels, and then finally on a meta level in the combined story of the original trilogy. The Star Wars prequels, by contrast, are similarly concerned with mythic journeys and archetypes, but they do not intend to track a Campbellian hero's journey. The Star Wars sequel trilogy doesn't have anything like the imagination or the talent to correspond with any particular archetypal set, though J.J. Abrams does attempt to ape the various steps in a shallow, unsatisfying way. The Last Jedi is the only exception, because unlike the bookending films in that sorry enterprise, it does have a mythic conception. It more closely corresponds with a particular set of mythic archetypes, but they are not heroic ones. That film, and the prequels, actually bring us much closer to the ideas that animate Dune. So now it's probably about time we stopped pissing about, and we dealt with those more specifically. If, after all, it were the case that Paul Atreides had been set on a hero's journey, from whence then comes Frank Herbert's statement that the difference between heroes and anti-heroes is where you stop the story. That doesn't sound very hero's journey-like to me. In fact, it sounds a little bit Last Jedi-like, don't you think? And in fact, as a piece of trivia, Dune was first published by the science fiction magazine Analog, edited at that time by a man called John W. Campbell, no relation, and at least in Herbert's telling, that Campbell rejected the manuscript for the sequel, Dune Messiah, precisely because it confirmed that Paul was not and had never been on a hero's journey.
He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy.
Heroes being that magazine's stock in trade at the time. There is, however, another mythotype pattern list that predates Joseph Campbell's by just a few years, and it so closely corresponds with the story of Herbert's Dune trilogy that simply listing it really entails spoiling important bits of Dune Messiah and Children of Dune. So if your aim is to avoid anything even remotely resembling spoilers until Denis gets around to adapting those sequels, well, please now combine your love of sex with your love of travel and fuck off. The myth pattern we're discussing here, which is categorically not a hero's journey, comes from Fitzroy Somerset, the 4th Baron Raglan, not a character in Dune despite the wonderful name. Raglan was a pretty interesting guy, former soldier who retired from the army upon inheriting his title, and who once argued that he should be let go from a government job on the grounds that he wasn't doing enough work to be worth the salary, which is an attitude one suspects Frank Herbert might have admired. More relevantly, he was something of a polymath, and he took a keen interest in the history of myths and the origin of mythic archetypes, which he translated into a 1936 book called The Hero, A Study in Tradition, Myth, and Drama. Unlike Campbell, who drew heavily on Jungian archetypes in the analysis of strictly heroic journeys, which must after all suggest that myths stem from a Jungian truthiness, if not quite the real truth, Lord Raglan develops work begun by James George Fraser in The Golden Bough, and starts from the premise that ritualistic drama is the family tree of mythic figures, and their commonalities say very little about real history. The dedication at the front of this book is to his children, Ginetta and Fitzroy, who, and I quote, enjoy fairy tales without believing them to be true. Raglan's not really a hero archetype is split into 22 points, and it was quite explicitly intended as a measure of the mythical, not the heroic, quality of any given figure, whether literary or those we consider to be historical. The higher the score, the more mythical the person is. Oedipus, for instance, pretty much aces the test. He scores 22 out of 22. For our purposes, though, it's useful in 3 ways. First, as proof that Paul's is not a hero's journey to begin with. Second, as a way of judging the thematic faithfulness of Denis' version of Dune. And lastly, as a means of demonstrating that thematic faithfulness alone doesn't make for strong characterization. In other words, that following any list of archetypes on which the book is based might be enough to make the journey compelling, but it's not necessarily enough to make the person going along that journey compelling. Which brings us, of course, to Paul Atreides. Let's compare him to the Raglan 22-point step. As with Campbell's hero's journey, a degree of flexibility with nouns is not only acceptable but expected. But, as also with Campbell's, a certain amount of discipline is also expected in order that the steps aren't rendered meaningless by broad definitions. This section will necessarily trespass on the following plot breakdown, but it doesn't replicate it. We're only looking here at the events in Paul's life and history as they correspond to Raglan's steps. Explanation and context is reserved for the following section on the plot. So, the first 2 steps in the Raglan journey are, mother is a royal virgin and father is a king. Well, in Duke Leto and his concubine Jessica, I'd say Paul in both book and film corresponds pretty well exactly. That's not quite true of step 3. In both book and film, we learn that Jessica is the illegitimate daughter of the Baron Harkonnen. Spoilers, by the way, but I think only in the book is Duke Leto explicitly said to be a blood cousin of the Padishah Emperor. The Baron Harkonnen refers to Duke Leto as share cousin, more an honorific than a familial hail, but borrowing here from the book The Sabres of Paradise, in which Napoleon, here the Baron, is snubbed by the Romanov Tsar Nicholas, who refuses to call him share cousin because he believes Napoleon not to be of noble blood. The influence is supposed to evoke the Baron Harkonnen's jealousy of the Atreides ties to the royal bloodline, but that doesn't really find its way into the movies. The films do have the Baron refer to the Duke as simply cousin, which, absent context or development later, slightly complicates matters, since it seems to imply that they are themselves blood relatives. If anyone's got an incest calculator to hand, I don't know what stage of is entailed by the Lady Jessica, who is the Baron Harkonnen's daughter, shagging Duke Leto, who is the Baron Harkonnen's cousin, at least according to the film. For the sake of balance and to avoid unnecessary complications, we'll just afford a half point to both versions of Paul from the book and the film, since whatever the case may be, the Emperor Leto and the Baron Harkonnen do form a familial political triptych. Steps 4 through 8 match in both the book and the film. Paul's conception is unusual, that's step 4. It's quite explicitly and destructively unplanned, at least according to the Bene Gesserit, which in turn fulfills point 5. Hero reputed to be the son of God. Paul is, after all, explicitly billed as the Messiah, even if the myth he's part of is scientifically and politically engineered rather than supernaturally. Raglan's 6th point is attempt to kill the hero as an infant, often by the father or the maternal grandfather. The Baron Harkonnen is, after all, Paul's maternal grandfather, and he does indeed attempt to assassinate Paul before he matures, so that's an exact match. Paul is then spirited away to Arrakis, which matches point 7, and if we stretch the definitions just a little bit, he is reared by foster parents in a far country, which is point number 8. I'm here allowing for Stilgar taking on the role of foster father, which occurs in the book because Jessica is much closer to Stilgar than she is in the film version, where the two barely interact, and they have nothing really approaching a relationship. So that's a clean sweep for the book here, and just the 1 point dropped by the film. Point 9 then stipulates that there are no details of his childhood, which doesn't apply in either medium, but points 10 through 13 are a direct match in both. He returns or goes to a future kingdom, this being Arrakis itself, or if you want to be more specific, it could be the Emperor's ship. He is victor over a king, giant, dragon, or wild beast. In fact, this is true twice over. Paul is the victor over both the Emperor and the Sandworms. He marries a princess, Irulan, which is point 12, and he becomes the king, or the emperor, which is point number 13. That's where Dune, the book, and the film ends, so by my count, Paul Atreides in Herbert's telling scores 11.5 out of the available 13 points on the Raglan scale, while Villeneuve's adaptation scores a respectable 10.5, making it a very close match and so a very faithful replication of the mythic structure Herbert was operating by. By the way, to show just how closely Herbert sticks to the Raglan model in the future as well, steps 14 through 22 are, in order, for a time he reigns uneventfully. He prescribes laws. He later loses favor with gods or his subjects. He's driven from throne and city. He meets with a mysterious death. Often at the top of a hill, his children do not succeed him, his body is not buried, and he has one or more holy tombs. The subsequent two books, Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, score by my count 7 out of an available 9 points. Paul doesn't die on the top of a hill, and his children do succeed him, though given one of them becomes possessed by the psycho memory of the Baron Harkonnen, and the other one turns into a giant worm, you could make the case for an extra point because, Frank Herbert was clearly fucking high. Oh, and by way of dismounting this particular horse, it's one of the many ways in which The Last Jedi is both more intellectually coherent than the other two sequel films, a low bar admittedly, but one it nevertheless clears, but also the least like a Star Wars film, since Rian Johnson essentially mimics Herbert in continuing Luke's story beyond the end of his hero's journey. After all, look at those post-heroic Raglan steps again. For a time he reigns uneventfully, he prescribes laws, he later loses favor with gods or subjects, he's driven from throne and city, he meets with a mysterious death, often on top of a hill, his children do not succeed him, his body is not buried, and he has one or more holy tombs. By my count, Luke in The Last Jedi scores at least 8, and quite possibly 9, of the 9 available points. He does reign uneventfully for a time, prescribing laws to his new Jedi Order. He later loses favor with his subjects, these are his students, Kylo Ren and the Knights of Ren, and he's driven from his throne and into exile by them. He meets with a mysterious death, rendered a pointless suicide by JJ in The Rise of Skywalker, since that establishes that his X-Wing can still fucking fly, but and he expires in his cave at the top of a cliff, which is as close to the top of a hill as you need to get, where he is not buried. And it's not a stretch to interpret that as a holy tomb, given the island is itself a holy place, and it marks the place of Luke's death. In short, Rian Johnson conceives of Luke not as a heroic figure a la Joseph Campbell, but as a mythic figure a la Lord Raglan. To paraphrase The Dark Knight, you either die a hero or you live long enough to become a sad, depressing old hobo. Back to Dune though, and the argument might follow, well, okay, we're only looking at the first book here, and don't the first 13 steps of Raglan's list correspond with the full 17 of Campbell's hero's journey anyway? And the answer is no, and also no. Two separate no's, resulting from two separate aspects of Paul that find no place in Campbell's schema: lack of agency and prescience, this last being particularly important since Paul fails to prevent the great jihad that he foresees. In the book at least, this is an unambiguously terrible thing. The film doesn't do quite so good a job of conveying these two essential points of his character, and so the film does slightly more closely resemble a Campbellian journey than the book does, but that's all relative. It's still not really a hero's journey at all, even in the film. It's true that many of Campbell's constituent parts are present in the Raglan list as well. There's the direct call to adventure in the Atreides summon to Arrakis, and there's an indirect one that permeates the entire story, which is the call to jihad. While Paul doesn't refuse the call to Arrakis, the entire story is encompassed by his indirect refusal of the call and his attempts to prevent jihad. The supernatural aid element is a curious one, since it's not personified in Dune. You could make the case that the Reverend Mother fulfills the role in the book, which defeats the journey point since Paul ultimately rejects her advice and her plans. Or you could say it's present in the form of the spice, though tempered by the fact that Paul is genetically and scientifically predisposed to it, and once again Paul succumbing to its visions is actually a sign of his defeat, not of his heroism. The crossing of the first threshold is the arrival on Arrakis, but you can read two separate belly of the whale motifs in his story. Paul could be seen to accept metamorphosis into the life of the desert rebel on the one hand, but on the other he rejects and fights against his metamorphosis into the role of Kwisatz Haderach, and his eventual acquiescence to it is again a sign of his defeat, not his heroism. Again, though, it should probably be mentioned that the film doesn't do as good a job of conveying this essential point, as we will see shortly. Moving into the initiation stage of the journey, the road of trials is so obviously present that it really needs no explanation here. But meeting the goddess and the woman as temptress stages are slightly harder to reconcile. If you're prepared to pretty much explode definitions, it's actually Paul's mastery of the sandworm that constitutes a meeting with the goddess, since the worm is thought to be a god by the Fremen, and mastery of it earns the love of their world. Otherwise, the two candidates for these two stages are obviously Irulan and Cheney, but neither makes for an entirely happy match, since the core of Herbert's creation is power, not morality or spiritual fulfillment. This means that Cheney could be construed as the temptress, in the mundane sense that she's the one Paul feels attraction for, and the one he prioritizes even at the risk of his grander ambitions. And then Irulan could be cast as the goddess, since marriage to her unlocks the entire universe in a political sense, but equally, Cheney could be the goddess figure, since shacking up with her constitutes the hero winning the boon of love, to use Campbell's own words. And Irulan could be the temptress, whose appeal lies solely in the political material rewards that accompany marriage into the imperial household. Here, the film actually diverges a little bit further than the book from this trope, by having Cheney reject Paul at the close of the story, about which there is much to be said, and much that will be said much, much later. Atonement with the father, which comes next, likewise has no clear and obvious match. An argument could be made for Stilgar in the book, since it's his position Paul looks set to usurp, and he has to trust that Stilgar will accept his political solution to that problem, leaving Stilgar in place as head of the Sietch, but supplanting him by taking up the mantle of the Duke of Arrakis. This, though, is fudged in the film. Paul's own father doesn't really accord at all, not just because he's dead, but because Paul doesn't have to overcome or be initiated by him, and he's not the ultimate source of power in the universe. Paul fulfills some of his father's wishes, but that's about the extent of it. Arguments for the Emperor and for the Baron Harkonnen, both of whom Paul must confront and defeat, and both of whom hold significant power, are similarly lightweight, since Paul never places himself at their mercy. They better match the ogres of Campbell's hero's journey, smaller interstitial things to be defeated and then overcome, not reconciled with. Really, and once again, it is Shai Hulud, the sandworm itself, that comes closest to this step of a hero's journey. This godhead creature that's an all-threatening menace, until Paul learns how to commune with and so make peace with it, relying on Cheney's faith and trust in that process. Here, though, we do have to point out that Paul is trying throughout to overcome his future, and at that task he fails, so it's not heroic. But if we do accept the sandworm as the father figure, it fits structurally, since it roughly coincides with the Apotheosis stage that is found in a hero's journey, when Paul drinks the water of life and gains his new perspective. But since Herbert isn't writing a hero's journey, Paul continues to resist his apotheosis right up until the last, and giving into it once again represents his defeat and not his victory. This likewise applies to the final stage of the second act's initiation, the ultimate boon, when Paul takes on, defeats, and takes up the mantle of the Emperor. Neither the film nor the book portray this as a particularly heroic thing, but it matters a bit more in the book because it unambiguously represents Paul's surrender to the call he's been refusing right up until this moment, while the film leaves open that Paul accepts that jihad is a result of his apotheosis. Both the book and the film leave off at the end of Act 2, going by Campbell's act structure, so the return is mostly outside our purview, save of course for the prescience factor, which I've argued already is less compellingly done in the film than it is in the book. After all, in the films, Paul's foresight reveals little besides an immediate victory on Arrakis over people the films have conveyed as being uncomplicatedly evil. Evil witches of the Bene Gesserit, an evil emperor who conspired against him, and the evil Harkonnens who murdered his father and terrorized the noble savages of Arrakis. There are at most a couple of lines from Paul in the film which suggest that the jihad might spread further, but it's barely present, never mind stressed. While in the book, not only are the people Paul beats more complex and morally nuanced, we are also left with much less doubt as to the complete destruction this jihad will bring to the entire human universe. Likewise, much less doubt of Paul's awareness of the extent of this destruction. Likewise, much less doubt that he surrenders to this fate more than he affirms it. It represents a defeat, not a victory. The book foreshadows more clearly what Dune Messiah will go on to confirm explicitly, that tens of billions of people will be genocided, that dozens of planets will be obliterated, and that whole peoples will be scorched and sterilized by a fanatical crusade that bests its own Messiah's attempts to control it. All of that takes place in the third act's return, which begins in the final scene of Dune and spans the off-screen intervening years before we pick up in the aftermath of Dune Messiah. But the prescient visions that afford us glimpses through throughout the first 2 acts show us conclusively that Paul's journey is not that of a hero's, that Paul's awareness of the doom he will bring and his failure to stop it makes him a tragic, not a heroic figure, that he is a mythic figure of the Raglan mold, not a hero of Campbell's. All of this is still clearer and more compelling than the Star Wars prequels or sequels, since Herbert never attempts to supplant Paul with another subject of the hero's journey. There is no Luke Skywalker to redeem Paul's Anakin, and there is no Rey figure to redeem Paul's Luke. And so there's no philosophical conflict between these two essentially different models, Campbell's hero and Raglan's myth, all of which makes Dune much more coherent, thematically and narratively, than what Star Wars has become. But it's also what makes Dune so much less lovely than what Star Wars used to be. A hero's journey, after all, represents a steadfast optimism running through all of creation, while the tragic myth of Dune only reminds us that faith in goodness so often results in fatal naivety. I will grant you that all of this has been tediously academic stuff, and it has at least as much to do with theme as it does with character, with Herbert's contention that this is a story about power, not morality, and with his continuation of the story long past the point beyond which even idiots could construe Paul as a hero. But we're not just here to talk about the themes of Dune. We are also here to talk about the plot, the character, and the world building, and to evaluate these new adaptations specifically. So, at long last, I think it might just be time to start talking about the plot.